Good evening. If you would, open up your Bibles and turn to Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9, that's where we'll be tonight. I want to start off by saying happy holidays, and as always, I am thankful for your presence here tonight, your encouragement, and your prayers. I want to start off with a question. Have you ever been enslaved to a sin that seemed to control you? You're wrapped up in a situation that feels so hopeless. Most of us have been there, and most of us have probably been there recently. Mark 9 is what we're going to be studying, and getting into this chapter, we're going to learn some things from Jesus about his power and how we can use his power in our lives to free ourselves from some of these things. The passage that we're looking at tonight in Mark chapter 9 comes directly after the transfiguration of Jesus. And if you remember, in the transfiguration, you have Jesus taking Peter, James, and John up to a high mountaintop. And on that mountain, he would be transfigured. And you would see Moses and Elijah standing beside him, and they're talking with him after his transfiguration. And you've probably heard it before that Moses and Elijah would be representatives of the prophets. And Peter wants to honor them, Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, by making them tents or tabernacles. And at that moment, when he says the words, a voice from heaven in verse 7 of chapter 9 calls out and says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." And this single sentence from God makes it clear that the time of the law and the prophets was fulfilled. It was time to listen to Jesus. And things could still be learned from Moses and Elijah, but they were to look to his Son for glory. So Jesus and the three walk down the mountain after these events occur, and that's where our text begins this evening. We're going to be doing a longish reading, so let's pay attention, let's be awake. It's probably been a long week for some people, and so let's focus in on the text. We're going to be reading verses 14 through 29. It says, "And when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them, and the scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed, and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, 'What are you arguing about with them?' And someone from the crowd answered him, 'Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able.' And he answered them, 'O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me.' And they brought the boy to him. And when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell down on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, 'How long has this been happening to him?' And he said, 'From childhood. And it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us.' And Jesus said to him, 'If you can. All things are possible for one who believes.' Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, 'I believe, help my unbelief.' And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, 'You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again.' And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, 'He is dead.' But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he'd entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." So you see in verse 14 that there are great multitudes. So as Jesus and the three approach this great horde, he notices the disciples are right there in the middle of the crowd. And they're with the scribes, and they're arguing, and the scribes are doing what good scribes did back then, and arguing. Knowing the context, we might assume that they were arguing about the disciples' inability to cast out this spirit. And the second the crowd notices Jesus, they see him and they're greatly amazed, and they run to him. And we think about why they might be amazed. This is right after the transfiguration of Jesus, so maybe his face was still shining a bit. Well, that's probably not the case, because Jesus told Peter, James, and John not to speak of the transfiguration, so it would probably not be evident on his body. So I think the reason that they're amazed is the timing with which Jesus arrives. Jesus arrives directly after his disciples have just failed, and that would be amazing to the people to see the teacher walk up on this interesting situation. And it's kind of funny because, it's the same for us. Like when we leave town for like a week or so, it seems like everything just goes all terrible. When we're in town, it's a normal week, it's fine. But then we leave and it's like all of this stuff starts happening. And that's what it seems like with Jesus here, is that he goes on the mountain for just a little bit, and his disciples get in trouble or arguing with scribes and have lost their faith seemingly. And we see why this is a big deal. Jesus has asked this question, "What are you arguing about?" And the answer to his question would have been discouraging. In verse 17, the followers of Jesus are acquainted with him. This man says, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for the Spirit has made him mute." So this man did not actually bring his son to Jesus physically himself, but he brought him to his disciples. And the answer to Jesus' question would have been pretty discouraging, because his disciples were supposed to be able to do this kind of thing. In Mark 3 and verse 15, they were given the ability to cast out demons. And then we see them doing that in Mark 6, verses 7 and 13. And it says, "And he called to the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2, and gave them authority over unclean spirits. And they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick, and healed them." So this is something that the disciples were used to doing, and they're not able to do it. So the man would not have been wrong for bringing his son to the disciples here. It would be like bringing them to Jesus. And that's a good lesson for us when it comes to discipleship, because people are going to equate the followers of Jesus together with him. So being a disciple is being a reflection of your master, ultimately. And like Eric talked about this morning, we're going to be dim reflections of our master, but we're still supposed to be images of him. So that's how this man saw it. He brought his son with the unclean spirit to the disciples, and that's how we should see it, that we are reflections of the master. But we need to remember that if we claim to be disciples of Christ, people are going to equate us with him. And they're going to bring their problems and sins to us, and we're going to need to provide answers. So we shouldn't disappoint them, and more importantly, we shouldn't disappoint the master. We see their lack of faith in verse 19. And he says, Jesus, when he approaches the disciples, he could be talking to several here in this story, but he says, "O faithless generation, How long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? So he's rebuking this crowd for their faithlessness, and I would believe the disciples directly here. This is something, as I mentioned, that they had done before. They should have been able to do this, but they lacked the faith this time to be able to accomplish the task. And they might have been unable to do it this time because they were scared. And what I mean by that is that this demon seemed to be pretty scary. If you were to be in a room or in an area with this demon and he starts seizing the boy is thrashing around on the ground, he's grinding his teeth, he's foaming at the mouth. That would be a pretty scary thing to behold. And if you see this demon, then you might be scared and your faith goes away. Gerald did a good talk this last Wednesday about faith on the water and Peter's faith specifically going away. And it's in the same scenario. Peter was scared on that water, and they might have been scared here. They might have lacked faith because of the crowds. When they were presented with an audience, they might have been unable to do this good work. I played soccer growing up, and it always seemed that in practice, I could do these things that were amazing or whatever, but then when it came to the game, I could never do it. And it's because I think the crowds made me nervous. You know, you have an audience, and you can't do the same things. They might have lacked faith because they placed their faith in themselves. And this is a tendency for us as well. When God blesses us, we have this tendency to forget where all the blessings came from. And we think about the disciples in this situation, and they might have said, yeah, this will be easy. I've cast out 100 demons. I've always been able to do it up until this point. And a good analogy for this type of thing would be like when we first start driving our car. If you're driving, when we first start driving our car, then we're cautious and we're concerned because there's danger around every corner. It might seem a little slippery on days like today. But then you get in that car for the 1,000th time and you're not concerned with any of the things around you. You're used to it. And oftentimes that's when the accidents happen. And I think it's the same type of scenario with the disciples here, that they have put their faith in themselves or in their power or whatever else it might have been, and they've lost focus from where that true power came from. But ultimately, whatever was causing their lack of faith didn't matter because they needed faith in God. And that's our story too. We approach life, we need faith in our lives to conquer the demons around us. God gives us this power to destroy these things in our lives, and then we give ourselves the credit. We think we've done something. So let's always maintain this working faith in God. Verses 20 to 27, you see the healing take place, and you see that the Spirit first causes damage. In verse 20 it says, they brought the boy to him, and when the Spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. So the demon clearly knew that his time occupying the boy was short at hand. So he did everything in its power, the Spirit did everything in its power to hurt the boy. You also see that it's not an overnight problem. Jesus asks the father of this son how long this was happening, and the father says, since childhood. And that might seem like a small point to make, but it would have made the healing or the miracle so much more powerful, knowing this question, knowing the answer to this question, that if you know this person, this son, has been dealing with this demon for his whole life, and then Jesus has the power to cast it out, that would be so amazing. Then you think about how it tries to destroy him. That's what the Father says about it. So it's not just an overnight issue. It's not just causing him damage, but it is trying actively to destroy him. It would throw him into flames and into water with the exact purpose of killing the boy. And then knowing the background of what this family has gone through, obviously we feel sorry for their situation. We think about this type of scenario and we can't help but feel sorry for them. And you can see that the father, when he comes to the disciples, has really high hopes that his son would be healed. But ultimately his hopes were dashed. And his question to Jesus, or his plea to Jesus rather, even seems pretty hesitant when we look at it. He says, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. So Jesus then backs him up and says, if someone has belief, then anything is possible. And that man could have reacted so many ways, but he chooses to say the words, I believe, help my unbelief. And that acknowledgement of his own belief, but also the fact that he still had a ways to go, was enough for Jesus to see he was genuine. And that's a beautiful moment in Scripture. But after Jesus rebukes the spirit in verse 26, the beginning of it, the boy cries out and convulses. And really, the spirit has no power over this boy, ultimately. Jesus has the power in this situation. But the little power that the spirit has left is going to use it to convulse this boy and cause him even more pain. And then eventually the spirit leaves. Then you see that the boy was like dead. It was so much of an ordeal that everyone in the crowd thought this boy was dead. And then ultimately, he's raised. Jesus takes the child's hand and lovingly brings him up. You see the compassion of Jesus in this story, just like the Father had requested. So remember these slides when we come back to this idea here in a little bit of how this applies to us in our lives. But we see the reaction of the disciples after the healing. And they ask this question, why couldn't we cast it out? And it seems like they were pretty embarrassed about this situation. They take Jesus, or wait till Jesus is in a private place to ask this question. And his reply was that this kind could not be driven out by anything but prayer. So Jesus had already given them the authority to cast out these demons, but it could only be exercised effectively if they had prayer in their lives. The parallel account in Matthew 17, verses 19 and 20, they ask the question, it says, the disciples came to him privately and said, why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. So in the text in Mark, prayer is the answer to this situation, and in Matthew, it's faith. So I don't think these are contradictory texts, but rather ideas that go hand in hand. Faith and prayer go together. A faithful person is going to be praying about these kinds of situations. So going back to those slides I said before, where you look at our healing from our sin. When we look at miracle stories like this one, it's kind of hard to apply these to ourselves. We don't have demons in our bodies and like physically, like this boy had. And so we don't apply these kinds of stories to ourselves. We say like, well, that's a good story. It shows the power of Jesus, but how can I apply this? And I think when you apply this to our sin, it becomes really clear. And our sin often functions in the same way as this unclean spirit. And I'll show you what I mean. it causes damage in the same way that it caused damage to this boy. So in a spiritual sense, our sin is doing the same kinds of things to our soul that this spirit was doing to the boy. It causes us immense pain and suffering and causes us to doubt the Father. I want you to think about your life for a second, maybe a sin that you deal with, and how it's damaged your life in the past. How many of us in this room would choose to never commit that sin if we could? If we had one wish in this life, how many of us would wish to never commit that sin? Never pick up the bottle, never search that word, never tell a lie. How many of us would do things differently if we had the choice? But because we made that choice and we can't go back, that sin has ravaged our lives. It causes us immense damage. Our sin also tries to destroy us. In the presence of Jesus, this demon tried to destroy the little boy. And you'll recognize this in your own life, that the second you see that you need a solution to your sin, you try to approach Jesus, and it seems like the temptations increase dramatically. In verse 20, they brought the boy to him, and when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell down and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. The closer the spirit got to Jesus, the more it was going to try and hurt the boy, try to destroy him. And our sin will act in the same manner. The closer we get to the Lord Jesus Christ, it will try to destroy us. And ultimately, that's Satan's intention always in tempting us. We might find comfort in our sin, but it will ultimately destroy us if we do not fix it. And we also see that it's not an overnight problem. When you truly dwell on your sin, you might find that new sins crop up here and there. I've kind of been interested by that in my life just to see how in my 20s the struggles I'm dealing with are different than the struggles I dealt with in my teens, and many of you can testify to the same thing. But ultimately, the things that we dealt with when we first started our walk with God are still the things that we deal with today, many times. This is not an overnight problem, at least not generally, or at least generally it's not. And if we're truly aware of our sin, as I mentioned before, we find comfort in it. We like to keep it around. There have been times maybe in your life where you've tried to get this sin to dissolve, but ultimately you bring it back because it brought you some kind of comfort. But we should take no comfort in these things. And we ultimately understand within ourselves that there is no peace in these things. But that's where Jesus comes in. And his words bring us healing. The text says in verse 25 that Jesus rebuked the spirit. And you think about that in terms of this passage in the context of this text. You think about Jesus is talking, he's rebuking the spirit of a deaf and mute boy. So you think about if the words of Jesus can have an impact on a deaf and mute boy, then how much of an impact should his words have on our life? That's something to consider. His words hold immense power in our lives if we give them the opportunity. So we have this saying again, I believe, help my unbelief. And you think about this miracle here and how the Father and the Son have been dealing with this problem for so long that they've probably lost their faith in many regards. But in this situation, you see it proven true that this man still had something left. He says, I believe, help my unbelief. And many times you might have found yourself saying words like these in the presence of Jesus. Lord, I don't know how you're going to fix me, but I know that you can. I believe. But there are parts of me that don't believe, and I need help in those areas. I've said these words. Maybe you've said these words too. Belief can help you conquer anything. Those are the words of Jesus. It sounds a little corny in this day and age because people are telling you to believe in all the wrong things. But Jesus' words will help us, and we can believe in him. So whatever that sin you're dealing with in your life is, whether it's anger or lust or pride or any other kind of selfishness, believe. And if you believe, then Jesus can heal that problem in your life. I didn't really think about that in preparation for this lesson, but it's the end of the year already. This is the last Sunday of this year. Think about the things that you don't want to carry on into next year. A lot of times we think about the goals that we have in our life for next year. Think about the goals that you would have regarding getting rid of these sins. Like I mentioned before, if anger is a problem for you, leave it behind. If lust is a problem for you, never view anything again. Never act on that again. Don't let that be something that is carried on unto year. When Jesus acts in our lives, there's often this response as well, crying out and convulsing. So when the spirit is rebuked, the boy is thrown down and convulsed almost worse than ever. And when we're ripping the sin out of our lives, this is what it feels like, convulsing us around. And that could be literal or figurative. You think about sins like addictions and how there's literal convulsing when you get rid of those things in your life. Literal shaking of the body. And then figuratively we relate because our spirit feels like it's being tossed to and fro when we get rid of these things. We often feel like dead after they're gone. You get the sin out of your life finally, and you can feel exhausted, but then you can also feel liberated and free. That old man is dead. That person you used to be is dead now. And then Jesus raises us up. Jesus is the provider of our change, and ultimately this is in comparison with our own resurrection. This story right here is a precursor for what it is with our resurrection. When we die to our sin and then are ultimately raised up, that's what I think of with this story. And God's glory and power is showcased in this text and in many other texts like this in a way that we should appreciate more. That his Son can raise us up from our dead state and is willing to have compassion on us in the midst of our sin. So I ask the question, what do we have to do? We have to believe. We have to believe that Jesus can rid the sin in our lives. We have to believe in his power to keep that sin away. And all things are possible for the one who believes. We're about to sing this song about Jesus being our loving shepherd. He truly cares for us like a shepherd with his sheep. You know, Psalm 23 is one of the greatest texts in the Bible because it shows God's nature with us. And Jesus says about his own heart, I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will have rest into your souls. Believe in his power, don't rely on your own, and you will make it through. If you have any need, if you need prayers from the congregation, or if you would like to become a Christian tonight, please let one of us know as we stand and sing.